All right, so good evening, folks. Welcome to spring. Winter will be back in a few days. Um, and we'll pick up with some for Friday, which conveniently is you don't even have to turn the page because it was the psalm that we just finished services with, and as I mentioned, um, this is a pretty short psalm. It's only, I think, 3 or 4 verses. So we'll certainly, as long as nobody asks any like provocative questions that will lead me on, you know, unhinged tangents for 20 or minutes or half an hour, we'll finish this and move on to the psalm for Shabbat as well. Um, so um, so this is Psalm 93. Adonai Malach Geut Lavesh. Okay, and so Adonai, right? So the Hebrew is, I mean, the English in the updated Sim Shalom says Adonai is sovereign, um, crowned with splendor. I'm not sure that that is that good a translation. Um, right. All right. So Malach, I mean, that's a root that you all recognize, right? Melech to rule. So sovereign is um, not a bad translation for rule. But if you look at the the grammar, the way it's conjugated, malach is actually in the past tense. Um, Having said that, um, tense in biblical Hebrew or in Hebrew at all does not work the same way as it does in English. Okay. And there is actually no present tense in, um, there is no present tense in Hebrew. That what passes as a present tense is actually a verb, a noun form of that same root. But if you like there's a piyut, there's a poem in the High Holiday Liturgy that some of you may recall. Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, right? Um, and which our mocks would translate is Adonai Melech, the Lord reigns, the Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Melech. The Lord reigns, the Lord has reigned, the Lord will reign forever and ever. But Adonai Melech actually means God is king or God is ruler or God, so it's actually a noun. It's not really a verb. So I don't know. But so anyway, God reigns, God is sovereign, Geut Lavesh. Splendor is not a bad translation, but Lavesh does not mean crowned. It really means he wears, okay? He wears splendor or robed in splendor. I've seen also, which is probably I'm not sure why crowned with splendor. Oh, because it's robed in strength, so he doesn't want to use um, the same English word for two different Hebrew words. Okay, but so God is crowned with splendor. Lavesh Adonai Oz Hit Azar. All right, so God wore Oz Hit Azar. He girded himself with strength. Af tikon tevel bal timod, and he established tevel is universe actually. He established the universe that would never be shaken, that would never be like shaken like in an earthquake, right? So it stands firm again. I mean, it's not an exact translation, but it conveys, I think, the same idea. Nahon kisachame o me'az, your throne has been like firmly established from time immemorial. Me'olam ata, you are eternal, you have been around forever. Okay, so but all right, so we know like the meaning of each word or each sentence, but what is this? What is this verse or these couple of verses telling us? Right, and so this is the psalm for Friday, right, which is the sixth day of creation, right? So what happened on the sixth day of creation in the biblical story in Genesis?
I think God created the animals, the
God created
cre- creatures,
humanity.
humanity. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
right. I mean, we right in Genesis 1, right? In Genesis 2, I
Mhm.
mean, this is why, I mean, even the most fundamentalist Jews have not treated Genesis as history the same way fundamentalist Christians have, right? Because in Genesis 1, you have humanity created as the very last thing in creation prior to Shabbat. But in Genesis 2, human beings are the first thing created, right? So, if it's meant to be history, like which one? I mean, Alan, if you had an opposing witness um, telling both of those stories, you would certainly tear into them,
Or
right?
wouldn't even need to. You just say to the jury, ladies and gentlemen,
Right. You just
this is
point
what
it
we
out to the
heard.
jury,
This is what we
yeah.
heard. They're both not true, depending
Or
on
that
what we're
well, they
looking
can't
for.
both be true.
Right. They're mutually
Right.
well. You know what? The issue, though, and it's always been my issue here. What is a day? What does is mean? But what is a day? If the day, in the eyes of the Almighty, are 1,000 years, if that's the time frame, maybe
Right.
they are both true.
Well, no, because we're not only talking about the amount of time, we're also talking about the order,
Right.
right?
Well, it's
And
not.
so,
It's
so
not that
human beings
order.
can't
Right.
be the last thing created and also the first thing created, right? I
That's
mean,
correct.
whether that creation took, 6 24-hour days or 6 eras of 100 million years each is irrelevant in terms of the order of creation. Two different things. Um, but all right, so I'm not again, right. So it was the rabbis who decided that this would be the psalm for Friday, right? The psalmist did not decide that this would be the psalm for Friday, but for whatever reason, the sages who arranged not only the Siddur, but I think the assertion that the Levites sang the particular psalm on the particular day in the temple is historically correct. They saw a connection somehow between um, this psalm and the creation of humanity. All right, but I mean, I think what this psalm is certainly asserting is that God is sovereign over the universe, sovereign over nature, right? That and I think that's important, right? Because one of the key concepts of paganism is that like nature has its own independent existence, right? That I mean, and this is I mean certainly in terms of like sort of Celtic neo-paganism and Gaia and stuff about which I do not know a lot, admittedly, and that's almost on purpose because it doesn't interest me, right? But I know enough about religious anthropology, right? I mean, and you had certainly in Greco-Roman right? Different gods were the gods of different phenomena, right? Um, which is almost the personification of that natural phenomenon. Um, and from the very beginning, I mean, even if you accept, as I do, the idea that our ancestors sort of gradually evolved into a pure monotheism, they didn't endow the various natural phenomena with divinity, right? So that God is sovereign over creation, and creation indeed is like God's garments, and we see this in not only in this psalm but in many psalms. I mean, if you look, I mean, for those of you who might have this Siddur, right? I mean, so right on the same page, right under this is the Psalm for Rosh Chodesh, right? Psalm 104, and I'll just read the first couple of sentences, right? Let all my being praise Adonai. Adonai, my God, you are great indeed, clothed in splendor and majesty, wrapped in light as in a garment, unfolding the heavens like a curtain. On waters you lay the beams of your chambers, you make the clouds your chariot riding the wings of the wind, right? So that light is God's talus, right? I mean, that's when it says God is clothed in splendor, the universe is God's clothing, is God's raiment. It's subordinate to God, it's not independent of God. Um, and I'm sure if we thought long enough, we could connect that to the creation of humanity. But I mean, I think even just a quick thought, right? So according to Genesis 1, human beings are over nature, right? And then God is over human beings, right? So if there's a hierarchy, right? God, human beings, everything else, right? And so um but the point I think is the assertion of God's um, control over nature, and that it doesn't have any independent existence, right? And that God is the creator of nature, right? Nature didn't bring forth God. God brought forth nature, and that is why we say his throne is eternal. All right. So unless there's any questions or comments, we'll go on. Nasu neharot Adonai, Nasu neharot kolam. All right, this translation is very poetic. It's not literal. The rivers may rise and rage, the waters may pound and pulsate, the floods may swirl and storm. Okay, the the rivers lifted up Adonai. The rivers Adonai lifted up. The rivers lifted up their voice. I mean, the word call means voice or sound, but it also means thunder. It does mean both in Bible. Yesu neharot dohyam. The rivers lifted up their not sure how to translate this word. But yeah, may swirl and storm. Mikolot Maim Rabim Adirim Mishpereyam Adir B'Marom Adonai. Have to actually the B part of the verse in English you'd have to translate before the A part. God is great in the heights or in the heavens, greater than the sound or the thunder of mighty waters. The breakers of the sea. Okay, so above the crash of the sea and its mighty breakers is Adonai our God supreme. Okay, now this I mean I think most sort of contemporary non-fundamentalist scholars would see in this an echo of older Middle Eastern mythologies. That is to say, where God conquers, like the seas, the waters again are like independent beings, and that creation is God conquering the seas, right? And actually, I mean, we see this in the very beginning of Genesis, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, v'haaretz haytat ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water, right? But in at the beginning there was chaos, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water, and God conquered. And we see there are echoes of this in other Psalms too, like the Tahom, which means the depths. It's not in this Psalm, but it is in other Psalms. There was, I think, in Babylonian mythology, a sea god called Tiamat, and Tiamat and Tahom are cognate words, right? But in Genesis 1, and that's why, I mean, Genesis and the Big Bang are not inconsistent. I mean, they're not identical, but they're not inconsistent either, because Genesis 1 does not posit creation ex nihilo, right? That there was nothing and then God created something, right? There was always something, right? Bri, right? Haaretz haita tohu vavohu, as like the King James, right? And the earth was without form and void. Without form and void is not the same thing as non-existent, right? And that creation in Genesis 1 is not ex nihilo, it is imposition of order on chaos, right? And so that's what is going on here as well, right? Like you have these waters and they are loud and they are mighty, but God is mightier than those waters, right? And God is enthroned above those waters, and that's what creation is, and that is a testimony to God's power. Okay. Edotecha nemnu ma'od, your testimonies are very, your testimonies never fail. Again, it's not an exact translation. Ne'eman means faithful, but faithful in the sense of trustworthy. Okay, so your testimonies are your testimony are very faithful. Your testimony meaning like the Torah, meaning revelation. They are your testimonies are trustworthy. Levedcha nava kodesh Adonai leorech yamin. Holiness befits your house. Holiness is appropriate for your house for eternity. Okay, so again, what is this? What is this psalm trying to convey to us? Right? What are we meant to get out of this psalm?
I think it's the unitary executive theory only applied to God. God is the reigning sovereign and has total sort of mastery of the universe and creation, and we humans are, and everything else is subordinate to it.
Right. I no, you're actually right. I mean, it's a very sort of like clever way of putting it, but I think you're right. It is right that the forces in the universe that are at play are not rivals of God and are not independent of God, right? And I mean, so later on, I mean, not so much in the Psalms, but later on, um, the great sort of other system that Judaism is arguing against is dualism. I mean, and I mean, look, there are still Zoroastrians around, right? Not a lot. There is actually a Zoroastrian temple in Boyd's. I've never been there, but I would like to go there one day, I think. But there still are but when the Persian Empire was at its height, right, before Islam, it was Zoroastrian, right? And Zoroastrianism is dualistic, right? There's not one God, there's two. There's Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the god of light and the god of darkness, right? And I mean, we see echoes of this theme in the Bible, right? Light against darkness. And then again, much later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? That like the writings that are unique to the Qumran community as opposed to, most of the stuff that was found at Qumran is just, the generally the oldest known extant copies of like our normative Bible, but there's also sectarian writings from Qumran. And that's the great theme, right? The children of light versus the children of darkness, right? And they're for sure. I mean, I think they're definitely by then, in contact with Persian dualism and whatever, right? But biblical monotheism says no. There, that there's not, and that I mean, it's one of the problems that I have with certain strains in Christianity that are almost dualistic, right? In their emphasis on the devil or Lucifer or Satan or whatever, and that it's not. I mean, bracketing the question of whether the Trinity is monotheistic. I don't even want to go there, but let's posit that the Trinity is monotheistic. But nevertheless, right? They elevate Satan to almost, equal power with God, and that's clear as dualistic. And I think it's I mean, from a from the perspective of the Bible, it's heretical, right? I mean that there are not all these little powers in the world that are, challenging or rivals to God, but that it's all created by God and it's all under God's dominion. Yeah.
When I was in college, I took a course on Milton. It's a long story how I did that, and I wouldn't do it again if I could. But it was a wonderful course because it was a great teacher. And of course, we had Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. Yeah, they do, in that type of literature too. They certainly raise the idea of Lucifer and the idea of the Lord, but that really doesn't get it. I mean, if you really, and we get to a point, and I always think this way, trying to contemplate the Almighty to me is an ant standing in front of the Empire State Building. You just aren't going to get it. I mean, you can get little bits of it. You can be good here, you can be good there, but you're not going to get it. And I think that the idea of a dualistic system, or like the Greek and Roman, the multiple gods, albeit that Juno and Jupiter were superior, sovereign gods. That's just a way for civilizations to try to make it easy for human beings to understand this. And the same thing with some of the more fundamental Christian groups, beware of Satan. But I think that, to me, one of the real strengths of our tradition is that you have to try to deal with this unknowable, call it omniscient, omnipotent, whatever terms you want to use, but the highest degree of power. And I think that's all this is really saying today, that we have a deity, we have an Almighty who is beyond all that.
Right. I mean, look, I have two responses to what you just said. One is that, look, undoubtedly, um, we can't possibly comprehend God, right? And so um, it, it's it's metaphor, right? I mean, and certainly, later Jewish thought says it's metaphor, right? Or for Maimonides, we can't say what God is, only what God is not, right? The via negativa. I mean, Maimonides wasn't unique in this. I mean, I think, Saint Augustine was the same way, but um, at the same time, the Torah asserts that this unknowable God nevertheless sought to convey his will and even his essence to human beings, right? I mean, that's what revelation is, right? It's um, and look, for the most part, Judaism has said that we know God through the text, not through reason and not through contemplation, right? I mean, and it's only like um I mean, I guess the earliest thinkers who tried to sort of um harmonize the two would have been Maimonides, right? But more significantly, German thinkers, right? I mean, Hermann Cohen, who was not that long ago, right? The early part of the 1900s. So but the Jewish tradition has insisted that we know God through the text, which are divine revelation, and therefore I mean, not only convey something in God, but are themselves divine. But all right, so should we go on to the Psalm for Shabbat? Or
Sue had her hand up.
oh, I'm sorry, Sue.
No, that's okay. I do think that it probably would be a lot easier to deal with personal tragedy or even the tragedy that, different tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people as a whole, if you had a dual system because you know we always have to deal with how can you know our Bible talks about a loving compassionate God, and then people have children that die of leukemia at 5, and you have tragedies like the Holocaust, and you have tragedies that affect even today, like in Israel. And most people just kind of don't even bother to talk about it because there's no rational way to explain it except to say we don't know what God is thinking. It seems to me that if you had a dual God, it would be easier to believe in a compassionate God because you wouldn't have to load him up with all the tragedy. You could blame that on the other one.
Yeah, no, I think psychologically you're absolutely correct. I mean, I would say that, I mean, in a certain sense, good and evil are in the eyes of the beholder, right? I mean, if you look at, I mean, particularly given the religious coloring of the current war, right? I mean, apparently, I mean, if the Military Religious Freedom Foundation is to be believed, I have no reason to think that they shouldn't be believed. I mean, lots of commanders in the US military are explicitly telling their troops that we are fighting for Christ and this is part of the end times. There have been over 40 reports of that. And given, given who our Secretary of War is, I you know I mean, the reports may not be true, but they're certainly credible. Let's put it that way. But is the fact that missiles took out almost the entire top religious leadership of Iran, is that good or evil? Right? I mean, it depends on your perspective, right? And similarly, I mean, an Iranian missile hit a synagogue in Beit Shemesh, which is not far from Jerusalem, and killed 9 people in the synagogue. Um, Good or evil, right? I mean, from our perspective, very evil. I'm sure from the perspective of the, Shiite clerics in Iran, good, right? But the assertion, I think, that God is sovereign over nature. Look, this is it's very, very difficult, and in a certain sense, um, not in a certain sense. I think, to me at least, absolutely. The 5-year-old kid who dies of leukemia is a much more difficult theological problem than the 9 people killed in that synagogue in Beit Shemesh, right? Because human beings decided to send that missile, right? Who decided that that kid would get leukemia, right? I mean, that really is, I mean, even the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust happened because of, the decision of certain people in charge of Germany to murder millions of Jews, and other people to say, well, what can I do? I must follow the orders, and then other people to say, well, yeah, this is a terrible thing, but if we let these people come here, it'll be crowded and housing prices will go up, and maybe some of them are spies and it's not really our problem, and blah, 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 blah. And that's right. Everything that happened in the Holocaust is attributable to decisions that human beings made or refused to make, right? But that's not true of natural disasters, and it's not true of children dying of diseases, right? I mean, the only answer that I have, and I absolutely stand by it, is that I firmly believe, if for the last however many, what at whatever point in history you want to say this is when civilization started, right? If we had taken all of the resources that we devoted to finding better and more sophisticated and more efficient ways of killing each other, and instead devoted those resources to curing disease and curing hunger and so on and so forth, that I don't know, would we be disease free and famine free? Perhaps not, but we'd be a hell of a lot more advanced than we are, right? And the decision to waste all those resources on killing rather than on healing, that was not a decision that God made. That was just decision that we human beings made. But yes, I mean, emotionally, psychologically, absolutely, that kind of dualism, I think, is much easier to live with because um, you don't, right? I mean, look, because certainly as a rabbi, right, as a rabbi, the toughest question I get um, is why did God allow this to happen? You know, your guess is as good as mine, frankly. I mean, um, yeah. So I'm no answer really. All right, so let's look at the Psalm for Shabbat, just Psalm 92. If you've got, the Shabbat and festival, Siddur is on page 72. Um, if you have only the weekday Siddur, it ain't in there because Shabbat never falls on a weekday. Um, if you have the older Siddur, probably, I don't know, somewhere between 22 and 32. It'd be 22. It'd be page 22, actually. All right, now here it's interesting. This Psalm 92 says, like in the body of the Psalm, that it's for Shabbat. It's not just like assigned to Shabbat, later when the temple stood or when the Siddur was composed, right? But it says Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat. A psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. Tov lahodot l'Adonai. It is good to give thanks to Adonai. Lizamer l'shimcha elyon, and to sing your praise, O Most High. Lehagid baboker hasdecha, to tell of your love or your faithfulness in the morning. All right, so right, love and faithfulness, right? Because you don't want to translate, two different Hebrew words by the same English word. All right, so lahagi baboker chastecha, to tell of your love in the morning, the emunatha ba leilot, and your faithfulness at night. Ale asur ve'ale navel. With the asur is a 10-string harp. Okay, so they translate that as the lute. I don't know enough about archaic instruments to know whether a lute has 10 strings or not. Does anybody know? But asur, like you see the word eser is 10, right? So asur is a harp of 10 strings. Okay, so by using or upon the 10-string harp, and upon nevel is just a harp. Ale higayon bechinor. Actually, looking at the English translation, they just leave out a whole word, actually, right? Because they have asur, nevel, and kinor, right? But in the English, it has only lute and harp, right? Where so we somehow dropped a musical instrument going from Hebrew to English. But higayon is like skillful playing. All right, again, like I'm not sure again what is the difference between a nevel and a kinor, right? I mean, in English we translate both of them using the English word harp. I'm sure that there's a difference. Um, Kisimachthani Adonai b'fo'alecha. All right, you made me glad, Adonai, with your works. All right, your works, Adonai, make me glad. B'maaseh yadecha aranein. I sing with joy of your handiwork, right? I mean, it says creation. The English says creation, but it's really handiwork, right? Maaseh yadecha, the things that your hands have made, right? I will sing joyfully, right? Like lechuna ranana, it's the same word, or sing is like liranen is to sing, but to sing joyfully. Okay. Ma gadlu ma'asecha Adonai, how great are the things that you have made, Adonai. Ma'od amku machshavotecha, your thoughts are very deep. Okay. Any questions or comments on this so far? Again, thought why other than the fact that like the Psalm says it's for Shabbat, is there anything like Shabbat related or Shabbat connected to this Psalm? Yeah.
Rabbi, and this really, in a funny way, ties in with what we were talking about before. Because if you take Shabbos to study and to be thankful, but then at some point you can really start to contemplate. Not that we're going to get it exactly, but we may be able to get a little closer. These ideas of free will versus versus evil in the world, and where did that evil come from anyhow? But there is an evil, and to what extent we think some of this is metaphor, to what extent we think some of this is more accurate. But I think that what this is saying is you should take time to rest, but you also should really be thankful that we have, and we all do. Everybody here should be thankful for many, many things, and I think that's what they're getting at.
Right. I mean, look, I mean, there are two themes of Shabbat, right? I mean, and we say it even in the Kiddush on Friday night, right? We say Zikaron Lama'aseh Bereshit, right? A remembrance of the work of creation, and Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, right? I mean, you probably heard me say this at one point or another, or many points, right? I mean, in Judaism, there is never only one reason for anything, right? And what is, I mean, and the Kiddush says that quite explicitly, right? That what is the Shabbat about? It's about creation. What is Shabbat about? It's about the Exodus, right? And I mean, that's not just all right. So the rabbis wrote the Kiddush, right? But um, it's in the Torah itself, right? I mean, in Genesis, Shabbat is because of creation, right? I mean, that couldn't be more explicit, right? Um, right? Vayahulu hashemayim v'haaretz b'chol tzva'am, right? The the heavens and the earth and all of the heavenly hosts were the creation was finished, right? But in the Ten Commandments, Shabbat is because of the Exodus, right? Why? Laman yanuach avdecha kamocha, so that your servants can rest just like you, right? In other words, so that, right, because one of the things that should be troubling is the fact that we have the revelation at Sinai and the Ten Commandments, right? And we celebrate the Exodus, and then right after that we have Parashat Mishpatim, which begins with the laws of treatment of slaves, right? And so, how is it that the same God which brought us out of slavery now gives us laws of slavery and allows slavery? And I think at least part of the difference is that in the Bible, slavery is a circumstance. It's not an ontological condition, right? I mean, I think in like American slavery was an ontological condition. That is to say, right, slaves were categorically different than free people, right? And that's what, and I recognize that the 3/5 compromise was more about, the South wanting slaves to be counted in the census and the North saying no, right? So they come, right? It, but I think it also, there is a certain shadow lurking behind that compromise, right? Which is to say that slaves were not fully human, right? Maybe 60% human, right? And so that's why I mean by an ontological condition, right? Whereas in the Bible, they're not like somehow a lesser class of human beings or non-human. They're like trapped by financial circumstance, right? Like many people are today. And so we have Shabbat, right? Laman yanuach avdecha kamocha, so that your servant may rest just like you, because your servant is not different than you, right? Your servant was also created by God in God's image. And right, so yeah, so Shabbat is about creation and about Exodus, right? But I mean, and therefore Shabbat is more than just a day off, right? I mean, if you spend Shabbat just sort of lying on your couch doing nothing, you haven't really observed Shabbat, right? I mean, it's about, I mean, it's not only about what you don't do, it's also about what you do, right? And that's why I think, I mean, and I think a lot of contemporary conservative Jews, right? So they may not observe Shabbat in accordance with the all the different um categories of forbidden labor and so on and so forth. But if you have something that you always do, right, whether it's always lighting candles or always having Shabbat dinner or always going to synagogue or always whatever, studying something of Jewish content, then you are, partially observing Shabbat. And I'll wrap up with this. I know I told this story at least once, but I don't remember in what context. But so you know, I spent a year at a Trappist monastery, sort of self-financed sabbatical, but I also wanted to spend, every other weekend in a place where there was a Jewish community of some sort, right? Which, not surprisingly, there wasn't at the monastery, although there is a synagogue in Chico, which is, you know, 20 miles away. Um, but purely by chance, I mean, I knew the regional director of the United Synagogue, and he said, the synagogue in Reno, I don't know, their rabbi decided to leave suddenly, and they're looking for somebody, would you be willing to go there every other weekend? And I said, great. It was like exactly what I was looking for. So anyway, there was in Reno, there there is a not insignificant community of Persian Jews. Um, and there was this one guy, and they didn't live anywhere within walking distance of the synagogue, so it was a given that they were going to drive to the synagogue. But other than that, he tried to be like pretty traditionally Shabbat observant. And he came to me and he said, I have a real problem because he had like little kids, like elementary school age kids at the time. He said, I don't want my kids to watch TV on Shabbat, but they're getting bored out of their skull, and I don't want my kids to hate Shabbat either. So I don't know what to do, right? And this was before on demand, right? But there was still, I don't remember if it was DVDs or video cassettes, but that was like, and I said to him, I made a suggestion. I said, so here's my suggestion. Let your kids watch TV, but only Jewish content, right? Get, Jewish DVDs and let your kid watch Jewish DVDs, but they don't have to watch, Saturday morning cartoons or, wrestling or whatever. And, he thought that that was like a reasonable compromise. Um, and I think it is, right? I mean, like to say that, yeah, yes, we're going to watch TV, but we're not going to watch like just, the typical Drek. We're going to watch stuff of Jewish content because Shabbat is not only about what you don't do, it's also about what you do. There's a positive and a negative. Anyway, thank you very much. Um, Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Rabbi, would you tell me where